Oh hey, didn't see you there. Just so you know, this video is part of a two-part video series deconstructing the Wixoss anime and more or less on the Wixoss franchise as a whole. If you missed out on the first half, I highly recommend watching that first, or you'll likely be confused by what I discuss in this video. Not to mention I'm literally planning on spoiling the entire first and second season in this one, so yeah. Links in the description, don't say I didn't warn you. As for the rest of you, welcome back to my corner. That said, let's not waste any more time with the pleasantries and just start from right where we left off, shall we? Believe me, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Last time I talked about the majority of Season 1, and for the most part went into detail about how the actions of each of the main characters in Selector Infected Wixoss impacted both the lives of the other Selectors and the course of the series' storyline. Notice I said most, because despite talking at least in part about each of the six, there's actually a few things I intentionally held off on talking about until now, mostly because they come into play heavily when discussing Season 2, and as you may have guessed, that's the subject of today's video. Now, we know already that each of the characters are closely connected to one another, but among all of those, two of them end up having a bit of a deeper connection than most. In a way, they're almost like parallel lines. As much as I'd love to just come out and say who they are and be done with it, I'm going to have to take a quick detour in order for any of this to actually make sense. You see, before we can talk about the two, we have to talk about the one. Last time I talked very briefly about who Iona is in relation to the other characters, but we never actually discussed Iona relative to her L-Rig or herself, which means that before anything else, we need to discuss her in more detail. Believe it or not, Iona doesn't actually have a lot of character development in and of herself, which is to say that when we learn more about Iona, it's usually because of how she interacts with the other characters or how the other characters speak about her. For most of the series, Iona's wish is treated as a mystery, and because of that, Iona is kept in the shadows, so to speak. The first time we actually get any real interaction out of her, it's in response to her introduction to Ruko. As was stated, she believes Ruko's wish is blasphemous and has no qualms about telling her so, but this whole interaction becomes somewhat confusing to some people toward the end of the season, so allow me to make some sense of it for you here, in case you were in the practice of thinking that Iona's words during this interaction are hypocritical. You see, Iona, like Ruko, loves to battle. And while she wouldn't go so far as to say that she hated her life before the game, it was Wixoss which brought her what she apparently didn't even know she needed. What drives Iona forward as a result is her love for the game, and her adoration for the way it makes her feel to be enveloped in the experience of battling. You may think that for someone who is exactly like Ruko to refer to her as blasphemous is hypocrisy, and taken at face value, it is. However, upon further, or rather, deeper inspection, what's actually happening in this conversation isn't at all what it seems to be. Contrary to what Ruko believes is happening in the moment, Iona isn't reprimanding her for her desire to battle without restriction, but is instead making an observation about Ruko's nature as a selector, taking mental notes and internally questioning if Ruko is the selector she's been waiting for all of this time. This does not change the meaning it holds for Ruko, as a warning that her childish enjoyment of the game despite the stakes at play will inevitably lead to tragedy, but it does change our perspective on Iona once her wish is revealed in Season 1's finale. Iona's wish is to battle without consequence, but in her mind, the only way for that to happen is for her to become an L-Rig. Doing so will free her from a world she ultimately cares very little about, and allow her permanent residence in a world she truly longs for. However, simply becoming an L-Rig isn't enough, because as we know, the moment an Eternal Girl is born, the L-Rig and their selector switch places. In an effort to prevent that from happening, Iona would need a selector who seemingly had no intention of having her wish granted, but who was also willing and able to win, and who was skilled enough at the game to avoid losing 3 times and ending the whole situation. You can imagine how difficult that search would be, and if that's what Iona has been doing, it only makes sense that she would be going around crushing other selectors left and right. She isn't an evil force who takes sadistic pleasure in destroying the dreams of the other selectors. She's just hunting for a worthy selector who will be willing to take her as an L-Rig. This also explains why she throws the Iona fan event in the abandoned building at the end of the first season. As a way of accelerating her search, Iona has created a way for a mass of potential candidates to make their way to her. And by making a tournament bracket out of the event, she can ensure nobody has to lose their right to continue as a selector, which tells us that even though Iona will destroy a selector if she has to, it isn't something that inherently brings her pleasure or that she prefers to do. And if all that wasn't proof enough for you, Iona's Elrig flat out says it during the final battle between Iona and Ruko at the top of the Tetris building.
Oh, don't look so surprised. Iona's been ready to have her wish granted for some time now. She's won a whole ton of selector battles after all. It's just we had to wait for a certain condition to fall into place before we can seal the deal.
Ultimately, it isn't until Iona defeats Akira and learns that Ruko had also defeated her that Iona decides on Ruko as her selector, and following that decision, she puts her plan to put on a secret selector tournament into action. No longer as a tactic to aid in her search, but as a means to draw Ruko out and create the conditions necessary to fulfill her wish. It's only now that Iona's wish is finalized, to become Ruko's Elrig and live the life she's always dreamed of, the life of an eternal girl. The irony is that by the time this finally happens at the end of the season, Ruko isn't the girl who Iona once described as blasphemous. Not anymore. Calling the series a mix of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Madoka Magica like you see all the time is a blatant mislabeling of what the series sets out to achieve and the kind of story it's trying to tell. One of the things I feel like I need to slightly correct is the statement I made about Wixoss being a Madoka clone. While I stand by my belief that Wixoss isn't just a Madoka reskin, rewatching the second season in preparation for this video made me think about the similarities between the two in greater detail. Last time, I briefly discussed the similarities between the two characters, but I neglected to mention what makes them different, both in character and in story. Before I do that, though, I'm going to put a spoiler warning from Puella Magi Madoka Magica, if for some reason you've never seen the show and you were planning on getting around to it someday. Thus far in Wixoss, Ruko has made friends with Yuzuki and Hitoe, along with arguably Tama and Midoriko, and maybe Hanayo if you really want to push it. For all intents and purposes, though, the main two are Hitoe and Yuzuki. Now let's look back at Madoka. Excluding Hitomi, who doesn't really have any knowledge of magical girls or witches, Madoka also has two main friends, Mami and Sayaka. Yes, I know, that seems like a ridiculous claim. Just let me finish. Mami, like Hitoe, has relatively few friends, but that of course has nothing to do with her wish. She's nice and all, but nothing about her makes her death tragic other than her newfound friendship with Sayaka and Madoka. She doesn't have any family left in the world of the living. Nobody really asks about her once that happens, and in the case of Madoka Magica, Mami's solitude is what makes her death as tragic as it is, and why it so negatively affects Madoka and Sayaka. After seeing how high the stakes of what they thought was just a wonderful new life full of magic and battles can get, Madoka decides that no wish she could ever have is worth perpetuating the cycle, and vows to never participate again. Sayaka, however, has a wish that she cares too deeply about, and presses on despite the risk, something that ultimately backfires, because her desperation blinds her to what's really happening until it's too late. And though her wish was technically granted, her new form prevents her from being able to enjoy it the way she had hoped. Once she discovers Sayaka's deterioration, and the truth behind Kyubei's contracts, Madoka wishes for the power to undo the suffering and cheat the game, so to speak, which, by all accounts, should not work.
Are you trying to become a god?
But which does anyway, because the laws of the incubators are absolute, and their species is bound by them to make the wish happen, even if it creates potentially world-shattering, universe-destroying after effects, which Madoka's does. But the tragedy of Madoka Magica is that her wish is granted, and her sacrifice creates a rift, which allows for the renewal of energy and the happiness that Madoka wished for. Ultimately, though, Madoka's wish was a paradox, and arguably did more harm than good, depending on how you interpret the ending separate from the movies. Our parallels, then, are pretty clear. In Wixoss, Ruko's new friend Hitoe, whom she and her other friend Yuzuki met as a result of the game, suffers extreme consequences at the hands of that same game and then decides not to continue playing because the stakes are too high and the consequences too severe. On the other hand, Yuzuki pursues her wish anyway, only to realize that achieving her wish has changed her form, and she can no longer have it in the way she had hoped for. After witnessing Yuzuki's deterioration, Ruko decides to fight for a wish which, by all accounts, shouldn't work, because her wish is to essentially undo everything that's happened and return things to the way they were before the game began, to cheat the game, if you will. Based on that description, comparing Wixoss to Madoka Magica isn't exactly as much of a misrepresentation of the series as I made it sound like it was. I do, however, want to make it clear that within the intricate twists and turns of the story, Wixoss is, at its core, a very different series. I would argue that Wixoss is actually better at getting you to care about its characters and making the stakes feel higher at times. And aside from Homura, Sakura, and maybe Sayaka, most of the characters in Madoka Magica don't really get to have the same level of depth as the ones in Wixoss do. Obviously, I prefer the tragedy of Sayaka to that of Yuzuki, but I think Yuzuki's story works really well too, given that it centers on making the audience uncomfortable and justifying the use of a wish to make it happen. I could be here all day discussing this, and deciding which show is better is ultimately up to interpretation, because for the most part I believe that both are equally matched in deconstructing their respective genres with a tragic and dramatic spin. Ultimately though, that isn't why we're here, so the discussion on how they're similar ends right now. What makes Ruko different from Madoka is that while both characters are the same in desire and purpose, Ruko's wish and whether or not it comes true is entirely dependent on the cooperation of her Elrig, the fuzzy-headed and until now quite lovable Tama. But of course, in the heat of the moment, Tama is tricked by the creator and refuses Ruko's wish. This is where Season 1 of Wixoss comes to a close. In the show's final moments, Ruko's wish is denied her, but her opponent, on the other hand, is a tad more lucky. As was explained, Iona's wish was to become an Elrig, but until she had chosen a selector, her wish could not be granted. Seizing the moment and creating the cliffhanger that is to finish off the first season, Tama vanishes, and to Ruko's horror, Tama is replaced by a new Elrig, an Elrig who goes by the name Iona. No, of course we're not done yet. Look at the length of this video. All that extra time isn't saved for a sponsorship, I'll tell you that much. Like I said earlier, my plan here is to more or less spoil all of Season 2 in order to make a better analysis of it. Be that as it may, I'm still only a humble octopus. I'm incapable of covering everything, but rest assured I will try my best with this one. Without any further delay, let's talk about Season 2. Upon a first viewing, Season 2 is where the rules of the Selector begin to feel somewhat disjointed. Not only do we have characters overcoming their tainted wishes, like Hitoe, but we also have characters who still remember the game, such as Akira. It feels almost like the rules were written by, and subsequently are currently upheld by, the mind of a child, rather than an omnipotent force. As it turns out, that feeling is very intentional, but before we dive into that can of worms, let's take a moment to examine where each of the main characters end up in Season 2. To get the easy one out of the way first, there's Hitoe. Hitoe's unfortunate fate at the hands of her third loss is a tragedy, whose ending is surprisingly cheerful. Not only does she happen upon another talking Elrig, thus giving her an opportunity to try again to achieve her wish, but she actually receives what is arguably the perfect Elrig for the job too.
Nice to meet you, Selector.
With Yuzuki in tow, Hitoe is able to overcome the curse of the game. And not only does she end up with her memories of her friends back, but she's stronger now because of it. It's a really engaging little character arc, and because of that, I don't really feel the need to analyze it too much further here. What it means for Ruko, as well as the other selectors, is that the laws of the game and its corruption mechanic are not entirely absolute. With enough willpower, they can be overcome, which is a tad more than I can say about our comparison series, Madoka Magica. Getting Hitoe back is actually the push that Ruko needs to propel her wish forward. It proves that the power of the game has its limits, and that if someone was truly passionate enough about creating a happy ending for all of its players, that perhaps such a previously unrealistic goal could be achieved after all. As for Yuzuki, well, we talked a bit about her before, and as well done as I think it is, it still has the tendency to make people uncomfortable, so we'll be brief with her as well. In the second season, Yuzuki, or more accurately, Hanayo in Yuzuki's body, begins a relationship with Kazuki that makes them the subject of some pretty nasty rumors at school, and for good reason, might I add. There's a slightly bigger conflict at play here, but we'll come back to that after we discuss Chiori, since that discussion is going to come into play when talking about the Hanayo-Yuzuki situation. When we meet Chiori at the beginning of the second season, she's doing exactly what she's always done. She's overly excited at the prospect of becoming an eternal girl purely because she's drawn to the excitement she perceives is therein. Obviously, Ruko and Hitoe attempt to educate a still very naive Chiori about the truth of the game, but as it turns out, Chiori more or less already knows everything that has happened so far, though her description of the events is a bit more rose-tinted than Ruko and Hitoe are really prepared for.
It's just like the novel, the heroine becomes the card in the final chapter and it slaps you the big fat to be continued at the end.
If you'll humor me for a moment, I just want to say that I adore this whole interaction. The irony of the matter is that Chiori is presented in the same light here as the actual anime fans would be, talking about how insane the cliffhanger at the end of the season was, like she can't wait to see what will happen to our heroes next. It's a sentiment that I can honestly really relate to, as someone who remembers watching when that cliffhanger happened, and barely being able to stand the wait for Season 2, and I know I'm not the only one who felt this way either. What I really love about Chiori is that she treats the whole situation like it's her wildest dream come true. To her, Wixoss is a very real thing, but even after multiple warnings, she still only sees the game as some sort of magical escape from reality, almost how one would feel if they suddenly happened upon the universe of Sailor Moon. The tragic irony, if you want to call it that, is that, as an audience, we know that Chiori's understanding of the way Wixoss works is almost entirely incorrect. Though she knows the details from reading the Wixoss light novels, she only knows them in the way the novels portray them. In that sense, if Chiori ever got her dream and was able to see the truth of the game, it would crush her. The actual weight of living such an existence would be harder on her than she believes it would be. And for that reason, the audience has an active motivation for wanting to see her fail to accomplish her goals, which honestly makes her kind of an impressive character. The only time we see Chiori even come close to realizing how tragic the world of Selector really is comes about when she, along with Ruko, Hitoe, and Yuzuki, actually pay a visit to the author of the light novels. As it turns out, she also happens to be a Selector, but her situation is closer to Yuzuki's than anything else. You see, after learning from Chiori how accurate the light novels are to the actual events of the show, the girls decide that an audience with the author would be a good idea, if only because it potentially means answers to some of the questions that have been on everybody's mind since the ending of Season 1. Unfortunately, the author, Fumio Futase, refuses to talk unless she is defeated in battle. Using her now much less powerful Elrig, Iona, Ruko struggles with her desire to quit battling for good against Iona's ceaseless demands that Ruko battle with her to her heart's content. The dynamic between Ruko and her Elrig in the second season has been a shaky one for a while, with Ruko lamenting that she just isn't as good without Tama in her deck, and more often than not refusing to battle, which causes Iona more than her fair share of annoyance. In time, that disconnect between Selector and Elrig has made the team into an unstable, barely functional shell of the battle-ready talent house that Ruko used to be. Unfortunately, though, in this instance, there isn't much of a choice. Ruko battles against Fumio, and at the battle's eventual conclusion, Ruko is somehow victorious, and Fumio tells the group everything she knows. Moving back to Chiori, hearing of Fumio's tragic past is actually upsetting to her. Her faith in the game and her power of positive thinking is seemingly absolute, so when Fumio Futase, the idol that Chiori looks up to with equally absolute faith and respect, talks of herself and the game in such a hopeless and depressing way, Chiori does what any young girl in her shoes would do, and tries to use the happy-go-lucky message that she believes the game must surely contain to cheer Futase up, a tactic which is ultimately completely unsuccessful.
But it's all gonna work out! Fueled by the power of friendship, her stories will live on in your heart and continue forever!
Life isn't a damned book! The power of friendship can't save you! There's no such thing!
But I know you can do it!
I'm not a writer. I never was. But I can't stop. I don't know if it's the promise we made or something built into me, or just a fear of the abyss that keeps me going. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? I don't even know who the hell I am anymore.
Of all the moments in Wixoss, this is the only one where the cheerful, always upbeat, and hopeful side of Chiori begins to crack. Though, as to be expected, it never completely breaks, and she's back to her usual antics before too long. It's also important to note what this scene represents for the Elrigs who become humans. Because they are bound by the wishes of their selectors, in order to survive outside of the card, they must uphold the selector's wish, or they will vanish forever. There's a great deal of fine print associated with that, and it includes exceptions, but that's neither here nor there, so I won't be going into further detail about that. The point is, Fumio was an Elrig, who became the author known as Fumio Futase in order to fulfill the original Futase's wish of becoming an author. Of course, Futase's Elrig never knew anything about writing or books, and as a result, she only writes about Wixoss because it is the only topic about which she feels knowledgeable enough to write. With her latest book, the one which ended with a cliffhanger, Fumio's basket of ideas has officially run dry, and she's come to the conclusion that she is not happy, nor ever had been happy, living the stolen dream of another. That's why Fumio's Elrig, Anne, appeared before her. At this point, Fumio Futase is tired, sad, and only really desires an end to the putrid life she's been forced to regret. For her, battling is the only way to make that happen, which is why it's so troubling to her that Ruko initially refuses her invitation to battle, something that is confirmed at the conclusion of their meeting by Anne telling the girls off for assuming that everyone was in the same boat as them.
I'm sure you think you're acting on some sort of moral high ground by refusing to battle, but it's not that simple.
No, that's not what
Some people have no choice but to do this, and she's one of them.
Of course, whatever became of the real Futase is beyond comprehension now. Most likely, she's found a way to become human again, but no one really knows for sure. A moment ago, we brought up the Yuzuki and Hanyo situation, and I said we'd get back to it once I explained a few things, and now that I have, here we are. The problem with Hanyo is that she eventually begins to actually fall in love with Kazuki, after faking her emotional connection to him for long enough. Since her wish and Yuzuki's are now the same, you'd think that this would be a good thing, but it isn't. The whole time Kazuki has been operating under the assumption that nothing has changed about his sister, and living that lie is what's been bothering Hanyo. She wants him to know that he's not dating her, not his sister, which is a much easier thing to root for compared to the actual incest of the first season. In short, Hanyo wants to love Kazuki as herself, and not as a fraudulent version of his sister, and to that, I say, hurrah! However, knowing what we do about the way the game is played, that wish is technically blasphemous. That's the conflict that occurs between Yuzuki and Hanyo, and because I don't really have anything further to say about Kazuki at this point in time, I'll just leave it at that and allow you to come to your own conclusions about what the result of this little love triangle should be and who you want to root for. For now though, we know that there are ways around the rules, cracks in the ironclad rulebook, if you will. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the case of whom we'll be talking about next. Back in part 1, I described Akira as detestable, and I stand by that, though, as I said, she isn't exactly as cookie-cutter evil as we're initially led to believe. Following the accident which leads her to become a psycho stalker in Season 1, Akira becomes a complete mess. I mean, she already kind of was a mess, but the whole face thing didn't really do her any favors. With Akira's grasp on reality fading fast, someone needs to come along and save her. Unfortunately for her, though, someone does come along. And the resulting character arc is a sad depiction of manipulation and emotional torment that is equal parts brilliant and difficult to watch. At this point in the story, Akira's modeling career is effectively over. She wallows in self-pity, feeling sorry for herself in a veil of darkness that she has cast over herself. Garbage piles dot the floor, and the complete and utter disarray of her room in this shot is a perfect physical representation of her mental deterioration. In Akira's mind, she's lost everything. That's when someone from the agency comes to visit her, someone she never wanted to see again. With Iona's body now under the control of her sadistic Elrig, Urith, the image of Akira's suffering calls in a few favors and gets Akira back into the studio, where makeup covers the horrific scar that up until that point had been a physical reminder that Akira's dream had soured. At first, Akira's reaction to seeing the person she hates more than anything again is pure disdain, but as their meeting continues, the reality of the situation becomes clear. Akira's rival model, the one she wanted to see ruined, is no more. Instead, The stoic, steadfast Iona is now the grim and conniving Urith, something we can immediately tell thanks to the voice work and animation. At this moment, Akira snaps. The realization of what Iona has become sinks in as Akira falls into a state of hysterical laughter. This is because, as Akira so eloquently puts it,
I was fighting so hard to screw her over and she did it to herself!
The next occurrence between the two involves Urith telling Akira that she's beautiful, which at first is an action which serves to humanize her, but it quickly becomes clear what her real motivations are. While Urith claims to have feelings for Akira, doing everything in her power to convince her of that fact, Akira slowly begins to let her guard down against Urith, and as the series progresses, Akira begins to become more and more submissive toward Urith. At this point, Urith represents Akira's wish as a reality, but it's also important to keep in mind that Akira was in a state of disrepair when Urith took her under her wing. Even if it seems as though Urith is consoling and supporting Akira out of goodwill and pure romantic intent, the truth becomes more apparent as we move on with the season. All throughout Selector Spread Wixoss, Urith's actions toward Akira are manipulative and to a degree, abusive. She calmly and warmly welcomes Akira into her with the promise of an intimate and romantic connection, but also responds to any and all mistakes made by Akira with brutal verbal attacks. She uses her vocabulary and cunning to weave a tapestry of surface-level affection, which is double-sided and deadly, eventually creating a servant who would do anything to make her happy, and who asks of her nothing in return. Urith's controlling behavior can strike eerily close to home for many who have found themselves in a similarly abusive situation. From an outsider's perspective, escape seems obvious. Why would anyone go on loving a person who clearly has no real feelings for them, and who consistently denies them the connection that they are asking for while asking of them everything under the sun? But for one trapped on the inside, the relationship is a cage, not which traps them, but which keeps them safe. Their partner is the only one who could ever really love them as they are, or rather, as they see themselves. It does a remarkable job of making us feel for Akira, empathize with her, and though her actions and personality are still rather toxic, we feel for her on the basis that not even our worst enemies deserve the kind of life that Akira lives under the abusive command of Urith. It's a brilliantly dark twist on an already brilliantly dark psychological deconstruction, and it adds quite a bit to Akira's character to learn of her past and watch her suffer in this way. By the end of the season, the results of this kind of relationship are clear, and the way Akira shows her instability by talking to herself and biting her nails in this scene are a testament to that.
Urith! Don't leave me, I'm begging you!
Even when Akira risks everything to accomplish the tasks which Urith asks of her, it still brings her nothing but pain and guilt. The scars inside her now match the scar on her face, and the more desperate she becomes, the more dire things get. Finally, Akira reaches the conclusion that she must win at Wixoss to get what she wants, a road whose appearance is by now all too familiar. Her new wish is to give Urith scars, just like hers, and once her time as an Elrig is up, she plans to return to the game yet again, but this time, her goal will be to heal the scars she's caused. It's nuts, by the way. I just need to say that by this point in the story, Akira is so messed up from everything that's happened to her that she has no semblance of sanity left in her. As she walks away from Urith after stabbing her with a pen, Akira wanders into the abyss of Wixoss, now doomed to repeat the cycle. All the while, her Elrig, who is equally insane, chastises her for what she's done and what she's become. As for Akira the Aki-Lucky, this is where her story ends. Or more accurately, where her new endless life of torment as a selector finally begins. As for Urith, well, she disappears. After acting as Tama's new selector for a while, yes, you heard that correctly, Urith vanishes from the body of Iona, and a new personality emerges. One whose name is, well, Iona. It gets a bit complicated here, and we're running a tad short on time, so if you'd like a further explanation, / my theory on Urith's disappearance, you can pause the video and read that, since we won't really be coming back to it later. The important things we learn here are that the case of Iona proves that a selector can somehow be returned to their original bodies, and also that who we once knew as Iona wasn't really Iona at all. Now before we get into what that means, let's talk about Ruko. A long time ago, I made mention of the fact that Ruko takes the idea of being a burden on others very seriously, especially when it comes to her close relatives, like for example her grandmother. I also said that it had something to do with spoilers that we'd get into at a later date. Well, we haven't done it yet, and we're nearing the end of my analysis, so because I want to make good on my word and because I couldn't find a better place to put it, this is where we talk about Ruko's past. It's never verbally stated, and no real attention is brought to it at any point, but Ruko has a fear of attachment. When she was younger, her parents got divorced, and this event truly traumatized her. It made her not want to form close bonds with anyone, or do anything to make her mother upset, which as a result morphed her into a somewhat emotionless little girl. Whenever the two would go to the store together or her mother would ask if she wanted anything for herself, Ruko would always say no, leading her mother to feel distant from her early on. The stress of raising a child she believed had no emotional connection to her eventually became too much, and this is where Ruko's grandmother comes into the picture. You can actually hear Ruko's grandma talk to her mother about this over the phone, something which Ruko overhears and which honestly feels like it should be more of a major plot point than it is, but oh well.
There's no point blaming yourself for this, not anymore. I'm tired of hearing it. This has all been settled before. And I won't have you pretending to be her mother either. I don't hold a thing against you, but when you said you weren't meant to be a parent, I was inclined to agree and my opinion hasn't changed.
This is something that is used more or less as background knowledge throughout the series, with the line, "I don't know what you're thinking," being used as a trigger for Ruko's childhood trauma at multiple points throughout both seasons.
Because I have no idea what you're thinking, Ruko!
It may also be the reason why Ruko has such trouble finding a wish, as she doesn't want to do anything selfish which may lead others around her to begin to drift away from her, but I digress. That's the Ruko story. We see it developed a bit too as she becomes friends with Hitoe, Yuzuki, and later on Shiori, but that's all I really feel the need to discuss here, though I do acknowledge it as yet another brilliant layer of depth the series manages to juggle. But without any further delay, let's talk about what I mentioned earlier on, about two characters who seem to act as parallels to one another. We've already discussed the one. Time to go over the two. Or rather, the three. Fumio Futase sits alone in a room with her Elrig Anne. She's writing obsessively, trying to find something, trying to remember what comes next, but nothing comes. Desperate, and with seemingly no hope of finding any answers, she goes into a mindless state, the sound of her typing only drowned out by the pounding words in her head. Across the monitor, the words she's been stuck with all along find themselves sprawled across the screen. Tama's memories begin to return. The fuzz in her head begins to melt away, and things become clearer. As much as she understands, there's still so much she doesn't know, but the point of origin is now painfully clear. There's a room that we see toward the end of Selector Spread Wixoss. It's a sad, derelict place, left abandoned in the back of an empty house. The only windows are at the top of the room. Enough natural light for a person to feel comfortable, but no real sense of freedom or even a view of the world outside. This is life for a young, frail little girl, a child whose reality is about to change forever. This lonely, neglected little girl, who never once is given freedom to leave her isolated tower, is called Mayu. Mayu, as you may have guessed, is special. You see, this tiny, sad little room is the White Room. The plane where selectors go to become Elrigs, and the plane from which the game's power emanates. Indeed, Mayu is the creator of Wixoss. Mayu is the cause of everything we've seen thus far. Alone in her little room, she invented a game which resulted in vivid, imaginary tournaments. Tournaments in which everything was on the line. It was during this process that the parallel lines were brought into this world. The first Elrigs, Kuro and Shiro. Those names may be a bit confusing for you, so let me use names you might be more familiar with instead. Tama and Yuki. The rules came as she went. Mayu's game evolved in complexity and consequence by the day, until eventually it was all she had left. All Mayu cared about was the parallel lines and the roles associated with them. Tama, the girl of white, and Yuki, the girl of black. Both given childish roles of good and evil to play, both given a name and a sense of purpose by Ruko. In the end, all this suffering, all the chaos and the hardship, all of it came from the most primal of places. Loneliness created Wixoss. Childish naivety infected it, but it was the selectors in the end who spread Wixoss. The problem lay within Mayu's isolation. Since she never had any friends of her own, her will was always absolute. You were either something or you weren't. Everything to Mayu was just the way she had always envisioned it, black and white. But even those clear distinctions could never be perfectly in line forever. Yuki, the name eventually decided to be Iona's once we learned that she never truly had a name, desires to be the girl of white, a role decided by Mayu to fall into the hands of Tama instead. The final battle is the result of this childish spat. All this time, Mayu has been living with the game she had created, the nightmare she had willed into existence. In all that time, she never realized, or perhaps she never found herself able to accept, that within her there were two forces, both good and evil, wickedness and selflessness, white and black. In the end, Urith and Mayu face off against Ruko and Yuki, and eventually, Ruko and Tama. As the sides of the coin merge together, and the power of understanding the gray between the lines proves a victorious effort, the game finally ends. Mayu, the third parallel line, accepts herself, not as pure white or pure dark, but as with another show I talked about on this channel, a beautifully flawed shade of charcoal gray. In the end, what and how you analyze Selector Infected Wixoss and its second season are up to you. Is it a Madoka clone but with cards instead? I don't think so. But there's no problem with thinking that way if you do. At the very least, those of us who've seen this series before can agree. Wixoss is more than just a forgotten tie-in to an obscure Japanese card game. Wixoss is worth watching, and it's worth talking about. Wixoss is a deep and well-crafted selection you'll be glad to revisit. And if for some reason you've never seen the show and you watched this video anyway, now you find yourself wondering how the series ends, well, with 2 full seasons of Wixoss taking place after this, and a new season just on the cusp of coming out, I imagine I'll be returning to this series sometime down the road for future videos, but until then, the only one I have planned is a tutorial on how to play the card game, which should be coming down the pipeline sometime within the next couple months or so. If you want to stay nice and up to date, well, you already know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe, and hey, from my little corner of the internet to yours, thanks for watching. See you next time.